Okay, hello YouTube. So I got a very good response on my video on 3 things that you can do to improve your rating by 200 points, where I talked about breaking pins, I talked about loose pieces, and I talked about creating luft and making prophylaxis moves. In this video, we're going to be covering one other thing that you can do that'll really help you rapidly improve, and that's knowing how to handle pawn breaks in the middle of the board and knowing how to handle central tension. And this is something that class players have an extremely difficult time dealing with. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So, central tension. Like, how do we deal with it? What are the rules? And what is central tension? So central tension is basically e4, e5, and let's say knight f3, knight c6. Somebody does something like this. They play d4. This is called the Scotch opening. We're putting immediate pressure on the center of the board. This actually has a special name. This is called this is called a primary pawn break. Whenever two central pawns face off like this, like with a d pawn versus an e pawn, we call this a primary pawn break. If it's a wing pawn, like d4, d5, c4, we would call this a secondary pawn break. So this would be a c pawn facing off with a d pawn. It could also be an f pawn facing off with an e pawn. So the difference between these two pawn breaks, and the reason that we have to handle these two types of pawn breaks very differently, is because when you have a primary pawn break, you have pawns of equal value facing off. And when you have a secondary pawn break, you have pawns of different value facing off. So you have to handle them very differently. So there are some pretty good rules on how to handle different types of pawn breaks. So in general, when you're faced with a primary pawn break, since these pawns are of the same value, in general, you can go ahead and capture that pawn as long as you're trading an e pawn for a d pawn. So let's say we have e takes d4, knight takes d4. This is supposed to be totally acceptable. So why don't we try to defend this type of pawn break? Why don't we just try to hold it? Like, we could try to play something like d6 and just hold the pawn. Well, in this case, we're going to end up having a much worse position after white just decides to continue pushing that pawn with, say, d5, knight on c to e7, c4. And white has a very, very favorable version of King's Indian defense, where we've wasted some tempo and we haven't really developed our pieces even as much as we would in a normal King's Indian. So this is actually kind of bad. White's gained space and white has a very reasonable looking position. So that's kind of the reason why when we see this primary pawn break, 9 times out of 10, the best thing to do is going to be to take that pawn. Now, of course, this situation does change a little bit. Like in the Ruy Lopez, we often don't see this capture happen. Like, let's say we go down a really long middle game, and we have a slightly different scenario. And this is something really important to remember. And we go through the main line of the Ruy Lopez. We go through the super long main line. Maybe black threatens to play the marshal. Maybe we say no. And then maybe black goes back into the main line. We see a c3. We see knight here. We see bishop c2, c5, and then we see d4. And if you've ever seen a whole bunch of Grandmaster games in this position, you'll know that it is very rare that any capture takes place here among Grandmasters for quite a few moves. You won't see either e takes d4 or c takes d4. Why is this? Didn't I just say a primary pawn break, usually the best way to handle it is to take it? Well, you have to keep track of which pawns are actually being exchanged. So in this case, if you were to play e takes d4 and then c takes d4, you didn't just exchange 2 pawns of equal value, you actually exchanged your e pawn for white's c pawn. That's the exchange you made. So in order to make this an equitable exchange of pawns, where you've exchanged a pair of e and c pawns for a pair of e and c pawns, you would have to take twice. But as you can see, if you take twice, as soon as I take this pawn back, you're going to end up with a very bad weak pawn on d6. So that's why black, under these conditions, is not motivated to capture. So under these circumstances, in the Ruy Lopez, black will often leave this tension pretty much indefinitely. He'll just leave the pawns like this and try to make white make that decision. He's going to try to make white exchange his d-pawn. In this case, either one of these pawns that white captures will be an equitable exchange, because he's going to be exchanging his d pawn for his opponent's d pawn, because that's the only thing that can recapture. So if, for example, black were to play, say, knight c6, and we captured here, the only possible recapture is with this d pawn, and we've effectively exchanged d pawns. So it's much easier for white to relieve this tension than it is for black to relieve this tension. White can really relieve this tension at any time he chooses, or white can choose to keep this tension indefinitely. Black, on the other hand, it's never really beneficial for him to relieve the tension in the middle of the board. It's more beneficial for him to simply keep this tension indefinitely, because all of the exchanges in the center are going to lead to a bad set of exchanges. He's going to be exchanging an e pawn for a c pawn, or he's going to be exchanging both sets of these pawns and end up with an isolated pawn, neither of which is a favorable conclusion to this central tension. So there are other types of central tensions. We can have secondary pawn breaks where it is very favorable to take right away, like we would see in the Open Sicilian. You'll see just about every player almost immediately take this pawn. They will play c captures d4. Now this should almost be I hate this phrase, but I'm going to use it. It should almost be a no-brainer that we're going to be playing c takes d4 to create an Open Sicilian. The main reason is because with primary pawn breaks, as in the Scotch with e4, e5, and then white plays d4, we almost always want to take because those pawns are of equal value, and it allows us to catch up in development. This is a better version of that. It's the same type of primary pawn break. The d pawn is moving forward without backup from c3, but the c pawn is worth less than the d pawn. So not only are we making this exchange so we can start trying to catch up in development, but we're actually coming out ahead on the deal on a positional level. We're ending up with 2 central pawns versus 1, so really we should just be jumping at this exchange, and we should be capturing right away, which is basically why every single top player will immediately capture on d4 as soon as it's presented in an Open Sicilian. So that would be another example. So let's go over the really tough one kind of last. Like, how do we handle the tension in these secondary pawn break situations? Well, again, we run into a kind of issue where if black resolves the tension, and it certainly is possible for black to resolve the tension here if he wants to, the Queen's Gambit accepted is a thing, but from a positional perspective, it's a very difficult opening to play. Black wants to play d captures c4 in the Queen's Gambit accepted, but if he does so, from a positional perspective, he's already put himself in a tight spot. Because if white were to, say, get this pawn back immediately, with queen a4 check and queen captures c4, we can see that white has 2 central pawns and black has 1. This has been a favorable exchange for black. Black relieved that tension early. But of course, grandmasters do play like this. And the reason grandmasters play like this, and this is really important, is they intend to play c5 later and exchange their c pawn for white's d pawn. And if black doesn't get this in, black is going to be significantly worse. So it's very important that whatever variation black is playing in these exchange lines, that he's going to be getting in some sort of pawn break later. So now let's say that we do what we're really supposed to do about 90% of the time when we see these secondary pawn breaks, is we're really supposed to just leave the tension or hold it most of the time. So if we hold it with a move like, say, e6, the very classic Queen's Gambit declined, we are offering up one of our central pawns for white's c pawn. Now this is a better exchange for white. So now if white wants to, yet again, we're in a situation where it's okay for white to relieve the tension, but it's not necessarily okay for black to relieve the tension. Black can't afford that tempo loss. Now if white wants to relieve the tension, exchanging a c pawn for an e pawn is a good deal for white. Now he has lost a tempo, and now black has some good freedom of development to compensate for his slight positional discomfort. And these positions are supposed to be relatively close to equal for black, because black has a slightly freer ability to develop. It'll take white one more move. So basically, like after, say, knight c3, and let's say knight f6, bishop g5, c6, we will have to move another pawn before we finish our development with our bishop, And this gives time for black to, say, catch up and kind of finish his development, just as a for instance. So he can finish his development, and he can get castled a lot of times before white can get castled. Now, structurally, white has an advantage here, but black should be able to catch up enough in development to equalize. That's kind of the idea behind the Queen's Gambit declined for black. But if black is going to break his tension after playing a move like e6, he has to be fairly confident that he's going to be getting in another pawn break down the road, mainly the move pawn to c5, so that he can make that same exchange in the middle of the board. So what are basically the rules for what are the rules for tension in the middle of the board and primary and secondary pawn breaks? Well, the rules are, with primary pawn breaks, if they're not backed up by another pawn next to them, like not backed up by a c pawn, we are usually going to capture that primary pawn break immediately, like in the Scotch. For secondary pawn breaks, a lot of times, like in this scenario, it's not favorable for black to initiate that exchange, because not only is he trading a d pawn for a c pawn, he's going to be falling behind on tempo. So it's usually more favorable for black to sit there, but it is okay for white to initiate that exchange. White starts with an extra tempo, and of course that c pawn is going to be worth less than that e pawn, so that's going to be a favorable exchange. In general, when you're looking at central tension, you need to think about what you're giving up and how much time it's taking you to give that up. And a lot of times you might not be in a position to relieve the central tension, but your opponent might be. And that's just a situation that you're just going to have to let sit for a while until you're in a situation where you can relieve that central tension, which might happen down the road. So one final example of that, like let's say we have a French defense, e4, e6. And then we have d4, d5, and we have an advanced variation, and then black starts creating central tension, where he attacks this pawn on d4, and now white needs to defend that pawn with his c pawn. So we've created a situation where c pawns would get exchanged if we have cd4 followed by cd4. A pair of c pawns have been exchanged, and that's an equitable exchange. That's fine. So if black wants to initiate that exchange, that's fine. But if white chooses to initiate the exchange with the pawn on d4 with the pawn on c5, that would not be an equitable exchange. So if at any moment, like let's say after knight c6, we have d captures c5, bishop captures c5, this is not going to be an equitable exchange because we've just exchanged a d pawn for a c pawn, and that's not good. So how does white handle this central tension situation? Well, he handles it the same way that black would have had to handle that central tension situation in the Ruy Lopez. He basically just sits on the position because it's going to be a-okay for black to take here, but for now it's not a-okay for white to take here. So he would have to handle it like so. He would have to put his knight in the middle of the board and hold his pawn. Black could put pressure, and notice that because of this pressure, we can't continue to defend that square, but of course we also don't need to. You have enough defenders of d4. So here, white really just needs to ignore this problem. And this is, I've noticed that, you know, a certain level of players, they have a very hard time leaving central tension for any length of time. It is okay to leave central tension forever and ever if you need to. You are not obligated to take anything. And actually, if you can just let this central tension go for about 3 or 4 moves, white can and often does resolve that central tension on his own if black does nothing. So you can just continue with bishop e2, just completely ignoring the central tension. It's not a problem. If black takes, you take back. And then let's say black maintains that central tension. You simply castle and maintain that central tension. You found things to do without touching your queen side, without creating additional weaknesses, without blocking pieces. If you brought your knight to d2, you'd be blocking your queen. If you developed your bishop, you'd be losing your pawn. You found things to do without messing up your queen side or not defending the pawn on d4. Now, if black continues to try to find useful moves, you might think, well, I have no choice now. I have to move one of these pieces and potentially lose this pawn or create some sort of horrifying weakness on my queen side. Well, neither of those things is desirable. So at this point, it's perfectly acceptable to relieve central tension. It's not going to be a favorable exchange for you. You're going to be losing a d pawn for a c pawn. So from a positional perspective, that's not a favorable exchange. but you will be gaining tempo for it. So you can play d captures c5, bishop c5, and you can gain this tempo with b4. And then say after bishop e7, you can play a3, and then you can follow this up with the move bishop to e3, gaining more tempo, bishop to d4, gaining more tempo, and then you can finish your development with knight d2, b3. And white is actually better in this position. His pawn structure is worse, but he is better because he has two good bishops, and he has more space. And that compensates for the fact that he's just traded off a d pawn for a c pawn. And all he had to do to get here was allow that central tension to be maintained for about 3 or 4 moves. Okay, so that's central tension, that's pawn breaks, and that's how you handle them. I hope that you liked this video. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.